Final Fantasy is a lot of different things to a lot of different people, fans having their own favorite games for their own individual reasons, as well as having different takes on how they feel about the franchise's attempts at expanding into the world of film and television. But perhaps there is a question capable of uniting the fanbase as a whole, especially now that the much anticipated Final Fantasy XVI claims that the legacy of the crystals has shaped our history for long enough. And that question is, of course, what would it be like to have one of those crystals in your butt? Final Fantasy Legends of the Crystals is the anime that dares to ask that question. Final Fantasy Legend of the Crystals is a 1994 original video animation, or OVA series, featuring 4 30-minute episodes, respectively called the Wind Chapter, the Fire Chapter, the Dragon Chapter, and the Star Chapter. It has the, some might say, dubious honor of being the first animated piece of media produced for the Final Fantasy series, but despite that, it remains relatively obscure compared to titles such as Final Fantasy The Spirits Within or even Final Fantasy Unlimited. Putting the quality of the series aside for the moment, this is partly because Legend of the Crystals has never been properly re-released outside of its original run on VHS, even though it's now possible to find it online on platforms such as YouTube. Interestingly enough, in Japan, Final Fantasy Legend of the Crystals was simply known as Final Fantasy, without a subtitle to help differentiate it from the games. And speaking of Japan, a part of me doubts that the Legend of the Crystals would ever have made its way outside of Japan if it hadn't been for the breakout success of Final Fantasy VII back in 1997, since Legends of the Crystals wasn't released in English until later that same year. Despite this, Legend of the Crystals is nevertheless not connected to Final Fantasy VII at all, and is instead a sequel to Final Fantasy V, making it the first direct sequel to a Final Fantasy game. The anime takes place 200 years after the events of Final Fantasy V, and follows the adventures of Pretz and Linnali as they journey to reach the Wind Crystal. To their surprise, however, the crystal ends up taking residence in Linnali's butt, perhaps in order to justify a countless number of unnecessary panty shots. As their adventure continues, they team up with Rouge, the leader of a group of S&M Sky Pirates, and Valkus, the general of the Tycoon Air Force, who seems to harbor a powerful desire to be punished by Rouge. They're also joined by Mid, Cid's grandson from Final Fantasy V, who returns as a ghost to guide them. Banding together, they form a new generation of Warriors of Light in order to bring an end to a new evil, Death Gynos, who plots world domination from his fortress on the Black Moon. And that's basically it. If Legend of the Crystals didn't have Final Fantasy in its name, it would be pretty easy to miss the connection to the series, especially since the anime doesn't look that much like the game it's meant to be a sequel to. It even makes the outlandish decision to feature chocobos as featherless, even though Final Fantasy V was the game that really put the iconic yellow chocobo front and center with the relationship between Bards and Boko. The featherless version might be a shout-out to some of Yoshitaka Amano's concept art for the games, but the featherless ostrich in the anime doesn't really seem to embody the true fantasticality of Amano's concept art, if that's what they were going for. The featherless version had appeared earlier in the Final Fantasy III manga, although that version did more justice to Amano's design. Meanwhile, this is just weird. Overall, Legend of the Crystals has some cool moments, such as Pretz riding his bike and swinging his sword, in a way that seems to almost foreshadow Cloud's bike riding and Sephiroth's iconic sword in Final Fantasy VII, but mostly it's just a silly little adventure. Knowing what Final Fantasy has grown up to become in terms of storytelling, this anime isn't likely to appeal to all, or even most Final Fantasy fans. However, since Final Fantasy V itself has sometimes been noted for its silliness and light-hearted tone, it may be more fitting than it originally appears for the anime to share some of those traits. Final Fantasy V was the first game Yoshinori Kitase had a hand in writing, and allegedly his main contribution was to make it more fun. So even though Kitase doesn't seem to have had a hand in the Legend of the Crystals, his influence can still be felt, as that silliness translates relatively easily into anime. That being said, most of the time the humor falls a bit flat, but occasionally Legend of the Crystals is way funnier than it has any business being, especially through the character of Valkus. The most interesting thing about Final Fantasy Legend of the Crystals is probably just that it exists at all, predating the Pokemon anime by 3 years, which really solidified the possible marriage between video games and anime on an international scale. That being said, Legend of the Crystals can't really be said to be emblematic of the same pioneering spirit which has characterized the Final Fantasy games themselves, as well as the later film Final Fantasy: The Spirits Within, which tried to push the envelope when it came to computer-generated cinema. After all, it's a fairly mediocre anime which came out during a time when anime adaptations of video games were already being experimented with. Even Dragon Quest, the most comparable video game series to Final Fantasy in Japan, had a dedicated anime as soon as 1989, with Dragon Quest: Legend of the Hero Abel. Considering Legend of the Crystals in the context of the time it was produced, however, it is interesting to note that it originally received fairly positive reviews, even though it doesn't seem to hold up in retrospect. Ultimately, Final Fantasy Legend of the Crystals is a fairly lackluster attempt at creating an anime based on the Final Fantasy franchise, or at least it seems to miss the point of what the series would eventually grow up to become. Is it a timeless classic? No. Is it something that stands on its own? Not really. But if you like uninspiring villains, characters that are never properly introduced, and a mortifying number of underage panty shots, then this might just be the anime for you. If you're a Final Fantasy fan and have 2 hours to spare, you might as well take the plunge to experience what it's like to have a crystal in your butt. If you don't enjoy it, you can always stop. The safe word is Sakaguchi. Thanks for watching. I hope you liked the video and that you were able to get some insights into this often overlooked anime. Have you seen it, or are you interested in giving it a look? Let us know down in the comments below. But until next time, cuckoo!